And now look to Professor A.C. Grayling, Magdalen College, to continue the case for the opposition.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to bring the conversation back to the point of tonight's motion, which the leader on our side has very accurately identified as a modal matter. That is, it's about what is possible and what is not possible. So the proposition is that it is not possible that an authoritarian government might come into power in this country and do things that undermine our civil liberties and our human rights. And it's a very, very difficult furrow to hoe, that one, to claim that something is impossible, which is the burden that lies on the proposers of this motion. I'd like to remind you of some very, very familiar things about our constitution in the United Kingdom. Firstly, we have an electoral system, the first past the post electoral system, which produces in standard conditions, and we're not in standard or typical conditions at the moment, but which in standard conditions produces majorities, sometimes large majorities of seats in the representative house, the House of Commons, on a minority of votes cast, sometimes in the region of 35%. This means that the majority of people who vote in normal circumstances in general elections are disenfranchised. They're not represented at all. It's very, very easy to describe what's wrong with the first past the post system. One can do it as follows. Imagine a constituency with 100 voters in it and 10 people standing for election, 8 of whom get 10 votes each, 1 of whom gets 9 votes, and the last of whom gets 11 votes. That is the person with 11 votes who goes to the House of Commons. The other 89 people have no representation at all. So we have a very flawed electoral system. In the House of Commons, with an artificial majority on one side of the House, we have a body which is wholly unconstrained by any constitutional provisions at all. We have a sovereign parliament which is completely at liberty to exercise absolute powers. In 1882, Sir Leslie Stephen pointed out that if the House of Commons voted to make it illegal that there should be blue-eyed babies in the country, then it would be not merely lawful but obligatory to murder all blue-eyed babies. John Stuart Mill, in his book Representative Government, 1861, pointed out that the absolute power of Parliament was constrained only by what he described as a sense of constitutional morality on the part of the MPs who sat in the House, that is to say, on their gentlemanly constraint. Now you can immediately see that if you no longer have gentlemen in the House of Commons, and it is necessary to go back to the era of Lord Baker himself to find any such, then you can see that there is a risk at very least of that constraint not being exercised. In this sovereign parliament, without constitutional constraints, we find that the processes by which the institutions of government and those who populate them exercise their powers and carry out their duties are governed at most and at best by conventions, by traditions, in part, of course, by statutes which have built up over time, resulting in a constitutional order which has been very well described as a set of understandings that nobody understands. The evolution of the constitutional arrangements of our country from the glorious revolution of 1688 has been a series of accidents and expedients. It's a spatchcock affair. It's a very amateur affair. And it is such that it provides no ultimate restraint. We see that the argument among jurisprudence over the role of the courts in the political order is one where, today, for example, we have Lord Sumption writing that it's a very bad thing to review judicially the activities of ministers, that the Supreme Court should have no role in deciding what the duties of government are because it's an entirely political matter. But if that kind of argument is right, then it takes away, or appears to take away, the very last bastion of protection against misapplication of the powers of our Constitution. Finally, it's not merely a matter of the constitutional arrangements for the institutions of government, but it's also the case that those who populate those institutions, and in particular elected politicians, and the activists, a relatively small number of people who are instrumental in having candidates elected or selected in constituencies, and also the press in our country. A very, very difficult question, this one, because we all, I think, would be very much in favour of freedom of the press. We would like to see some post facto remedy available to people who are injured by what the press does, because as we all know, the press, in pursuit of financial viability, very often confuse what is in the public interest with what interests the public, and it's usually, of course, the latter. But we notice that the most widely read newspapers in our country, most widely consulted media outlets, are owned by wealthy, non-domiciled individuals who have an agenda. And just to quote one of them, Mr. Rupert Murdoch was once asked why he wanted to see the United Kingdom leave the European Union. He said, because when I walk into Downing Street, they listen to me, but when I walk into Brussels, they don't. And so the overweening power of the media, highly partisan media, given to distortion, given to false facts, given to being very much on one side of an argument and not being sufficiently dispassionate, and therefore not informing the voting public enough. Well, one of the great things that a constitutional and democratic order requires is good information, a good opportunity for discussion and debate. And when you have on the informal side of matters, so we've already seen that we have an uncodified constitution which places no limits on the powers of government. On the other side, we see a kind of Wild West in the media, which makes it very difficult for people to get hold of accurate, dispassionate information on which they can base their voting intentions. But to go back to the people who sit in the House of Commons, and even, but to a much lesser extent, in the House of Lords, it was mentioned that the system of party discipline, the whipping system, has a very distorting effect on whether or not the representatives in the House of Commons will use their judgments, vote in the interests of the country genuinely, will always try to do what the Code of Conduct from MPs says they must do, which is to put the country's interests before their party's interests and long before their own personal interests. And yet, if you think about why it is that MPs always obey the whips, almost always obey the whips in standard conditions, when there is a majority for one party in the House, constituting in effect one-party government, given the absolute control that the executive has over the legislature, and that the legislature in the majority exercises the unlimited power of Parliament. It's because if you don't obey the whip as an MP, you're not going to be supported again at the next election. You're going to lose your job. You're also going to lose an opportunity to become a minister or to get any kind of promotion. The whips make it their business to know your personal affairs. When you're elected as an MP, they invite you to tea, and they say to you, tell us all your secrets so we can watch your back in case the Daily Mail gets hold of some of them. And then 2 weeks later, when you think of voting against the government or against your party, they trot this out and say, the Daily Mail will know these secrets that you've told us unless you toe the line. And this is very familiar. Bullying and blackmail and control of MPs means that in the normal circumstances of parliamentary life, the body, the lobby fodder body of MPs in the House of Commons is under the control of the party system. The party system, therefore, is controlled by the executive. There is no separation of powers between executive and legislature in our system, because Parliament is controlled, well, the majority of Parliament is controlled by the executive. And the result of that can be, so I return to the modal point about what might be possible, that if you have unscrupulous people in control, or a powerful clique of people whose power will be in inverse proportion to the majority that the governing party hold in the House of Commons, and now we come to the current situation. The clique in question might be the European Research Group, let us say, or the Taxpayers Alliance and their representatives in Parliament. If you get into that kind of situation, you have an executive or a clique influencing the executive in such a way that those sovereign powers of Parliament could be exercised in extremely invidious and dangerous ways. The question before us is this possible? Could it happen? And the answer is, if there are no institutional protections against it, and there are none, then I'm afraid it could happen. And I very much worry whether or not we aren't witnessing something dangerously and unpleasantly close to that in our present circumstances. Mr. President, thank you.